It's daybreak, Anchorage, and a storm warning guides a fishing fleet safely into port. Singapore, a heart monitor sends updates to a medical team thousands of miles away. London, finding the perfect dress with a little help makes the experience special. Capture any moment on any given day and imagine all the critical data streaming from one end of the planet to the other across a global network. As it connects our lives and our livelihoods, it unlocks our greatest potential. It's a smart city remotely tracking the health of water pipes deep underground. It's intelligence in prosthetics, providing better patient care. It's edge computing, supporting interactive experiences, advanced robotics, and connected cars, transforming business to be better than ever before. The rhythm of all this moving data is the pulse of humanity. The ordinary and extraordinary moments of our lives. All connected by an ever-evolving network that is making every corner of your organization smarter.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rhonda Johnson, and I have the pleasure and the privilege to work with the federal regulatory team for AT&T out here in DC. So glad you could be here today with us this morning as we talk about modernizing networks and what it's going to take to make sure that we have connectivity not only for today but for tomorrow. So these critical networks play such a role in how we do the connectivity. And today we have a guest line of speakers that are going to do a job for us to talk about how we make that happen. And certainly this video that we all just saw tells us why it's so important that we modernize these networks and make sure that we connect everyone, everywhere, at any time. So as we think about today and the experiences and the conversations that we have, I hope that you'll be able to engage and understand why modernizing these networks is so important for our future. We have a great lineup of speakers who are experts in this space, who will discuss the role of these networks and how we meet those connectivities, the connectivity needs not only for today, but for tomorrow. Our first conversation this morning is going to be a fireside chat. We have Chris Sambar from our network team who leads our organization down in Dallas, and he will be having a fireside chat with Jonathan Spalter, who is the CEO and president of USTelecom. They'll be talking about how providers like AT&T are thinking about today's ecosystem of networks and what policies are needed for the industry to keep up with the customer demands and to make sure that no one is left behind. Following that, we'll have a panel. The panel will be led by Kelcee Griffis from Brew. She will have a group of speakers who are going to talk about connectivity and data-driven planning that can help us have a healthier, cleaner, and more resilient future. Joining her on this panel will be Karen Marsh, who is the Director of the Analysis and Capacity Division for FEMA, Kevin Thompson, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the Global Enabling Sustainability Initiative, and Saad Chaudhry, who is the Chief Digital Innovation Officer of Luminis Health. I think that'll be an exciting panel to hear how these applications really do make a difference in all these aspects of our lives. After the panels are done, hopefully you can stay around for a few minutes because we have an exhibit here right at the end of the hallway, which is our innovation exhibit. It shows us how things have changed over our nearly 150-year history, starting with that very first phone call from Alexander Graham Bell back in 1876, the history of the innovation and the many things that have happened between now and then, and how this new exciting technology, which is enabled and brought to life by the investments that we're making both in fiber and wireless technology. These investments make such a difference in our lives and how and what happens for all of us across this country. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started with our program. I'm going to ask Chris Sambar and Jonathan Spalter to come up for the fireside chat.
Well, thank you so much. Let me first start by thanking our colleagues at AT&T for welcoming us to have this very vital conversation about where we want to go as a nation technologically and aspirationally. And also to all of our friends around the country who are joining us through the power and promise of broadband and next generation networks. I would love to shine a little bit of a spotlight on what your journey has been through not only AT&T, but what got you here and what is driving you in moving forward in your work?
Sure. I've been in the network role for about 5 years now.
Great.
So yeah, I'm really enjoying it. Before this, I was in the FirstNet program when we started that up back in 2016-17 timeframe. So that was real exciting, and that's turned out quite well. We're really serving first responders across the country, and we're pretty proud of that mission. So anyways, and they moved me over to network, and they said, now we want the best network. We got the best first responder network. We want the best network. Figure out how to get that done for us. So it's been good. It's been a fun ride.
What a journey. And just as you've watched and witnessed in your own work the modernization of AT&T through its various iterations, you now are driving the modernization and the iteration of our networks. Let's talk about that for a second.
Yeah.
What does network modernization actually mean, in English?
Well, I know wireless pretty well because I had come out of FirstNet. I dealt a lot with the network engineering teams over in wireless, but I didn't know as much about the wireline network. I had worked on the old wireline network many, many years before when I first started with the company back in 2001, 2002, and it was that old copper network way back then. And so when I came to the team almost 20 years later, I figured, well, a lot of that copper network's probably gone and everything's fiber now, so it's all fiber and wireless. That was what I assumed, and what I didn't realize was for the next 2 years, I didn't have to spend as much time learning the wireless network, but boy, I had to spend a lot of time learning that old copper network because it's all still there. And the number of people using it is very, very small, but that network can't be shut down. That network can't go away until everyone is off of it, literally everyone. And the costs of maintaining are massive, and the effort and the thousands of people within the network organization alone is a massive effort just to keep that network up and running. So that was a big surprise to me 5 years ago, that how much effort and energy we're putting into the old copper network versus focusing on the fiber and the wireless networks. We're literally using copper lines that are over 100 years old. And we have customers in service on those copper lines. Now that's a technological feat, and we should be proud of our ancestors who put all that in the ground. And the technology at the time, it made sense to take that copper, those individual wires, and surround them. They didn't have plastics back then, so they surrounded them with what we call pulp or paper. So you open up one of these cables, and it's paper wrapped around copper wires, individual copper wires and paper wrapped around each one. That was a great idea back then. Problem is, when you get water inside of one of those cables, a pinhole, and water gets inside, like after a hurricane or a strong rain, suddenly the whole cable is wet. Then someone has to go cut it open, put fans on it for days or weeks to dry out the cable. It's incredibly inefficient. There's a lot better technology now. Fiber, on the other hand, you can get fiber wet all day long and nothing happens to it. We have fiber sitting in the ground in manholes and handholds that is underwater literally, and it works just fine, and nobody knows the difference. It's much easier to fix. You can open up a case, you can splice the fiber, fusion splice the fiber back together, and then close it back up, and if there's a little water in there in between the fiber cables, it's not a big deal. We just leave it alone. It's not like the old copper. It literally takes 2 to 3 times as long to fix a copper cable that goes out as it does a fiber cable that goes out. So there's all kinds of reasons why that old technology just probably needs to go away. And we're working really hard on doing that.
It is quite amazing if you think about it from an historical perspective that those 100-year-old copper lines might have actually been used by Herbert Hoover and Al Jolson and Benny Goodman.
Literally.
And they're still being required to be used.
It's amazing.
It's kind of like, if you think about it, it's like having to have a government edict to maintain an 8-track tape player in the Spotify world.
Yeah.
It's
what if the government had told Apple you have to maintain the Macintosh 2, the one that came out in 1984?
Sure. Because
people like it, they're still using it. They may not be able to afford to get a new one.
Right.
Those floppy disks are really cool. Got to keep them around. What if they had done that to Apple?
And they take up a lot of space.
Yeah. But and they look nice in a museum. But what if the government had told Apple you have to do that? You have to maintain those old lines of computers and continue to upgrade the code on them and continue to work on that. Would they be as innovative as they are today and launch new devices every year that have?
That's precisely
right. Yeah. Probably not. And we have the same burden. So we spend billions of dollars on an old copper network that we would love to take that billions of dollars and allocate it over to fiber to build even more fiber than we're building today. We're the largest builder of fiber in the US, but we would love to allocate even more to fiber, but we've got to turn off the old stuff.
Yeah. No,
What percentage of copper lines, millions of miles of copper lines across the US, are still in service? You know, and guess what percent? It's 5%. Millions of miles of copper in the network, and 5% of it's still being used, which doesn't sound like that big of a deal. So you only need to maintain 5%, but that doesn't work. If you think about how a network, think of the arteries in your body and all of the veins going all over. That's how the copper network is built.
Right.
So if you have a line going to a single customer way out in a rural area, you have to maintain that line from the central office all the way out to that customer in the rural area. And you may have a sheath, when you get back closer to the central office, you may have a sheath that's thousands of copper lines, really large ones, but you have to maintain that entire sheath of thousands of copper lines for a single customer that's miles and miles away. And that's literally how it works, and that's what we're maintaining today.
And the bottom line here is that if you're actually maintaining this copper wire network, imagine how those dollars could be redeployed more productively for actually getting us over the finish line on closing the digital divide, upgrading and managing and accelerating the modernization of networks for all of the new services that people are using. But let's talk a little bit about the policy aspects of this. So what do you think would be the most productive use of the time of our policymakers here to allow the transition to be accelerated?
I think my main role in this is I need to explain and shed light on it so people understand what the old copper network is and what we're trying to do with fiber. And I think a lot of people in DC, a lot of our lawmakers understand that. There's some great programs that are allocating dollars to build the networks in the rural areas, and that's important because, American Rescue Plan, the BEAD funding that's coming up, building fiber to people in rural areas, even suburban areas that are sparsely populated, houses are far apart, for example, even that, it becomes very, very expensive to build because you literally have to run a fiber all the way to someone's home in order to get them fiber service. There's other solutions, wireless, fixed wireless. We use those solutions to help retire some of our copper and give it to our customers as a substitute, and that works great. But helping lawmakers understand this is what the old copper network is. This is the cost to maintain that copper network. And these other companies like us, they're doing the same thing, maintaining this. It's a really inefficient use of a company's dollars that could be allocated to something much more efficient, forward-looking, innovative, creative, fiber. And that's really what we want to do. The switches, which is the electronics that run the copper network, the voice part of the copper network, those switches, if you were to see one, you go into a room like this, and half of the room is full of this giant electronics, floor to ceiling, humming, buzzing equipment. That stuff uses 8 to 10 times the amount of energy as just a server that can literally replicate what that giant piece of equipment is doing. We could put 2 servers in and replicate everything that equipment's doing. The question is, why don't you do that? You could save yourself hundreds of millions of dollars in energy. It's not economical to do it. So we've got this network equipment running in our central offices. We have to use a ton of air conditioning power to try and keep it cool. Sometimes it breaks and the parts are real expensive. So there's a whole host of reasons, and just educating people and letting them see all this, the light bulb usually goes on and they say, oh wow, that's a really inefficient use of your dollars that could be allocated to something a lot better.
And that same light bulb has actually been illuminated in previous technology transitions. We're not doing this transition for the first time. There are precedents that we can learn from. Why don't you talk a little bit about some of those other technology transitions that we've been able to manage through successfully that could set the stage for what we have to do now?
I think that's a great point, and we don't necessarily think about it, but it happens all across society today. Amazon wasn't told you have to keep all your bookstores open because there's a very small percentage, 5% of the US population likes going to bookstores. So Amazon, you got to keep your bookstores open. They weren't told that, right? They decided they'd go close all their bookstores, create an online marketplace, and now we all really enjoy that online marketplace that Amazon has created, right? They used old dollars and reinvested them into new technology. The wireless network is a perfect example. And wireless policy in America has really done a good job in this aspect, where you can look at other countries and they have not done a great job. So when the iPhone first launched, does anybody remember what it was launched on? What wireless technology? What generation was it?
Video?
Yeah, 2G,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It was 2G, and we were in the process of getting rid of 2G and moving to 3G. So I think it was the second year of iPhone that we went to the 3G iPhone. That was a big deal. It was really fast, right? Remember 3G was huge, really super fast back then. Nobody told us then, as we launched LTE, that we couldn't shut down 2G.
Right.
Everybody said, that makes sense, shut down 2G, and now go to LTE. And now we've shut down 3G in the US, and we're on to 5G. So we basically have 2 generations running at any one time. Right now we have 4G and 5G running. And you get to 2030, just past 2030, and we're going to start launching 6G, and LTE will slowly phase away. But the lawmakers in the US haven't taken an interest and said, you got to keep the old stuff running, because people like the old stuff. They like their old phone. They can't afford a new phone. They don't have all of those reasons necessarily. Those reasons exist, but they haven't levied that on us. And that's all we're doing on the wireline network, is we're regulating the original technology version, which is copper.
Yeah.
And that's something we have to, look at other industries, look at what other industries have done as far as innovation and how they reinvest in innovation, and let's move away from the old technology.
And it seems to me, too, that that this modernization is an equal opportunity issue, which is to say that it's not just our major national providers like AT&T and Verizon and Lumen and others that are needing to actually move forward on this modernization imperative. It's our regional providers, our local providers that are serving some of our most rural places. There are close to 1,000 of these providers. How does this modernization issue affect those colleagues out there?
Great point. We cataloged the number of fiber builders in the U.S. I think it was last year sometime. We found over 1,000. It was about 1,200 total companies that are building fiber. But a lot of them are not these rural telcos,
right,
because they are straddled with the government saying you're the carrier of last resort in that area, so you cannot shut down your copper network. So now you cannot reinvest into a fiber network, and these small rural telephone companies are now at great risk because they have to maintain an old, dilapidated network they'd rather not maintain. We don't want to leave consumers behind. That's not our goal here. But in almost every single case, we can demonstrate that there is another technology that the customer can be moved to that provides them the same, or in most cases, a better experience. A customer who has an old POTS line, plain old telephone service line, they can get wireless. They can get fixed wireless for data and from AT&T. They can go to a cable company that serves their local area potentially. They could go to AT&T's fixed wireless product. Dare I say they could go to Verizon or T-Mobile's fixed wireless product. So they have a lot of options to choose from. A lot more now than when the Kohler rules were originally written, which was there's a phone company and that's it. So we got to make sure that phone company serves these customers. That was in the early 1900s, I understand. And the government subsidized a lot of that phone company build back then, but that is not the case today. It's a very active and competitive marketplace, and there's a lot of solutions for customers out there.
Including one that you've been deploying. I had the opportunity to get a demonstration of this fixed wireless, essentially central office in a box.
Now, this is called AT&T Phone Advanced, and it's got all kinds of connectors on the side. Understanding the requirements and working with the federal government and the states, we said, okay, here's the device that we put together. It can work on any broadband line. So if you have a cable line coming into your house, you can plug that into this and it'll work fine. And it replicates all the features of the old phone service for both businesses and consumers. It'll also work over the wireless network, to your point. So you can plug your own old telephone into this and it'll work great. So this is an option for us because we said, okay, we understand you want to give customers the Macintosh 2C experience that they had in 1984. We want to keep that great experience so they can hear that dial tone. So we will create this. And so we've created this, and it's still challenging for us in some states to be able to turn down the copper service. So we're doing everything we can.
And I think conversations like this and education that it imparts is going to be part of that help. One of the issues that we have to actually think about as we're driving modernization in the networks is also resiliency, especially as, for example, local, state, municipal authorities are getting in the business of actually building their networks as well. How do we actually address the resiliency issues with respect to next generation networks, knowing that there are all of these new state public networks being built?
Yeah, resiliency specifically. It is very common that we will, every year, we're getting close to storm season now. We call it storm season, it's hurricane season. We had precursor last weekend in Houston. Unfortunately, they had some really, they were thunderstorms, but 100-mile-an-hour winds. Yeah. Hurricane season every year, and the networks go down. It's typical. Power grid goes down, communications networks go down, land mobile radio, wireless, et cetera, and it's usually power related. And we will have cuts. We will have fiber cuts, which literally takes a person going out in most cases. If they have to dig up a fiber line, it might take 6-8 hours. If it's up an aerial line up on a pole, it probably takes them less than a couple of hours to fix it, and then we're good. And then we can restore service. And within usually 48, maybe 36 hours from when the storm has come through, we have a significant amount of service restored. For first responders, we have mobile assets that we deploy, and we get them up very quickly, usually within hours of the storm coming through. The copper networks are a different story, right? You get the copper lines underground in the air, they get wet, and the answer I always get is it's going to take a couple of weeks to get that back in service because the paper inside gets wet. They're not all paper cables, but a lot of the old ones are. Paper inside gets wet, so they have to cut it open. They attach blowers to it, and they blow air into it. And if it's down in the Gulf or Florida, it's very humid, so it takes, a long time for those blowers to dry that out, to dehumidify and then blow the air into there and dry all that paper out before the copper lines will start working again. If there's another cable, you can switch the service to a different cable, but sometimes you don't have that option. The other option is we take that stuff off and we put fiber in its place. So you see this is a web of regulatory challenge that we're dealing with, trying to restore service to a really old product that is not resilient at all. Back to the original question. It's really challenging for us to work with, and it's challenging and frustrating for our customers.
And that seems to be one of the greatest paradoxes of the American innovation story, which is that government policy, regulation, almost categorically does not keep pace with the speed of innovation.
Right.
And there are real risks that are associated with the delta between those two concepts. How do you assess that delta, and what do we do about it?
It's tough in this one because if you look across society, from computers to technology, all the services that we use every day, any company that's been around for more than 10 years, they've gone through multiple generations of technology, and in most cases the government is completely hands-off and lets the technology wheel spin very quickly, and that's great. And that's been great for consumers in the US, arguably one of the most advanced societies on earth, and that's been wonderful. This is a challenging one because in the telecom space, you've got a really old regulatory regime that was founded back when the government was subsidizing and helping us build these networks, and we all understand that. And we're not trying to dispute that or turn away from it, but those old regulatory rules aren't serving the public good anymore. You've got this fast spinning flywheel in the economy of innovation and technology, yet over here you've got a really old regulatory regime that is impacting that technology wheel because we can't get fiber services out to customers fast enough. So it's a hard one to understand.
Well, and especially in the context of envisioning where we're going in terms of future connectivity needs. That, I imagine, is part of your job, which is looking through the crystal ball and doing forward planning as best you can on what those future connectivity needs are going to be. Give us a sense of the scale of those needs and what we should expect.
Yeah, so the average consumer on a DSL line, that's digital subscriber line, the old copper broadband services, they're anywhere from 400 gigabits a month of usage up to 600 gigabits a month. And those are speeds anywhere from 35 to 50 megabits per second download. Okay, that's older DSL technology. We still have some customers on the really old stuff, 3-4 megabit DSL. Remember when that was like the first internet we all got right after dial-up, and that was pretty fast. We still have some of those customers, but most of them we're weaning them off onto fixed wireless. So those customers are using 400 to 600 gigabits per month of usage. Our average fiber subscriber today they're over a terabit of usage, right? And they're over a terabit because they're taking advantage of the economy and the technology in the economy the way they want to. And we don't cap usage or speeds on our fiber services. Whatever you subscribe to, that's what you get, and you can use as much as you want. On the old copper services, it's just constrained by nature of the technology.
Right.
It's running through a copper wire instead of fiber. So you can see, just looking at the amount consumed in a month by those different subscribers, the old copper subscribers aren't getting the experience that they probably want to get because the speeds are constrained. Wouldn't it be better, shut that down, overbuild it with fiber, and let's move on to the new technology?
Sure. And as you're thinking through these network roadmaps, one of the accelerators of that roadmap, perhaps even a roadblock to the success of those networks, are the policy roadmaps that we have to also focus on. If we want to have terabit citizens, we have to have a very predictable, straight line of successful policy evolution to get us there too. Why don't you talk a little bit about what you think that roadmap should look like?
I think in any industry you need predictable policy so that you understand what the regulatory framework is going to look like for the years into the future. At AT&T, when we go to build fiber, our expectation is that fiber is going to be sitting in the ground serving those customers for 30 to 40 years. We still have fiber sitting in the ground that was built in the 70s and 80s that we're still using. So we don't know what the lifetime of fiber is. And that was much older fiber, not as resilient as the stuff that's being built today. So we don't know how long this fiber is going to last us. It might last us 100 years like copper did.
Right.
And if you don't have a predictable regulatory framework, you're just going to say, forget it, I'm not going to invest here, I'm going to go invest somewhere else in something else. So we need a predictable regulatory framework for years into the future.
And in terms of impact, it's also important to remember that capital expenses for the broadband industry combined have approached beyond $100 billion annually.
Yep.
And that is not a given. That level of CapEx has a input that needs to be thought through carefully, and that's the policy input. If we are going to realize the promise of a fully ubiquitously deployed network where everybody, everywhere can actually connect to next generation broadband, that's not just going to be done by our network providers. We can't do it alone.
Yep.
We need true partners in government to walk down that path with us. Network modernization will not and cannot happen unless there is not only predictability in policy, but flexibility in policy to allow that kind of investment and that kind of innovation to happen. And that's why I think that these kinds of conversations, not only for federal audiences, but for state and local audiences as well, is going to be indispensable to allowing folks like you who are managing our nation's networks to do their job well, which is why we're really glad that you're here having this conversation.
I appreciate it, Jonathan. Thank you.
Well, and it's a pleasure. Why don't we turn it to some questions if folks have them?
That sounds great.
We have a couple of microphones here. Why don't you say who you are, please, and introduce yourself?
Yeah, very quickly. My name is Pedro Alfonso. I'm president of Dynamic Concepts, Inc., a small technology firm. We spend a lot of time, some time on innovation, but a lot on old networks and the costs of that for not moving forward. My question is, it almost sounds like a type of digital divide that you have customers that can't move forward because of this old copper network. Is it driven more by the rural nature of some of those networks or lower income that are holding that customer back from education, healthcare, and everything else? So how do you feel that government's role to fix that?
I'll give you, I don't have the data at my fingertips, but I will say it tends to be more rural in nature is typically the issue. It can be a little bit of low income, but I will say, people are discerning about the services they buy, and someone in a lower income household isn't going to pay for an old telephone line that costs them $50 or $60 a month to provide plain old telephone service. People are smart. They're not going to do that. It tends to be more rural in nature. But again, it goes back to the challenge, which is, in most cases, we can provide them an alternative. We have this, or they can get services from other providers rather than using our old copper network. So there are alternatives available. A lot of times it's just people who want to hold on to older services. And of course you'll ask, I get this question all the time, well, why don't you just go to somebody who's got an old phone line and offer them a free cell phone? We've tried. Somebody in here has got an old Mac 2C at home, I'm sure.
Yep. I have a Commodore.
Commodore 64? That was a good machine.
Well, instead of looking backwards, let's continue to look forwards. And with your work and your vision for actually how we migrate the networks to be transformed and evolved and ready for the real opportunities ahead, we wish you well.
Thank you.
Chris, and thank you for your time, and thank you to AT&T for hosting this conversation.
Yeah.
Round of applause.
Appreciate you all coming. Thank you. Thanks to you, Jonathan. Appreciate you moderating. Really enjoyed it. Thanks, everybody.
So will the panel please come up?
All right.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me? Great. Welcome to the panel portion of this event. It's so nice to see you all. I'm joined by three lovely guests, and we're going to have a great conversation about the how, what, when, where, why of network modernization. We're going to be talking about why this is important and how it's showing up in your particular industries. In this increasingly digital world, I think it's easy for all of us as end users to kind of overlook the physical communications networks that make all of this stuff that we rely on just work. And if we don't have those continuous upgrades, you're not going to have that instant connectivity at your fingertips. So I think you're going to really enjoy what our panelists have to say about all of these innovations. With that, I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves. Let's start with you, Karen.
Hello, I am from the government. I am Karen Marsh. I'm the Director of the Analysis and Capacity Division at FEMA. That is on the resilience side of the house of FEMA. So we have response and recovery, and we have resilience.
I'm Kevin Thompson. I'm from the nonprofit sector, but really representing the business community in sustainability, and specifically the role of digital solutions and sustainability.
Hi everyone, I'm Saad Chaudhry. I am the Chief Digital Information Officer for Luminis Health. Luminis Health is a provider organization. We have 3 hospitals and about 100 outpatient sites around the Annapolis, Maryland to Lanham, Maryland area. So that's Middle Maryland, right on the coast.
Awesome. Well, we're going to get into all of your work and sort of where sustainability and network upgrades kind of intersect there. But I'd love to kick things off with a question for you, Karen. What does network resilience mean to you? And how have you observed its importance in your work?
Well, the most critical commodity in disasters is information, and that comes from communications. The emergency manager, their role really is to collect information, to synthesize that information, and then to prioritize actions and communicate back out. That's why FirstNet, what you heard, FirstNet is so critical to the emergency management community and first responders, because you need that reliability in disasters. So once we get that information, the most important thing we're doing is we're telling the community what to do. So for the safety and the security of the people in that disaster area. So that could be anything from providing the alerts and warnings to issuing evacuation notices, telling people to stay shelter in place, to take additional protective actions once you're staying inside. So that's all going back out to the community. So from the community perspective, those people who are in that disaster area, the first thing that goes through their mind is what's happening? Where's my family? What do I do? I need help. So that is where the communications is so critical, to have that communication between the public and the people who are running the disaster. Now you pull back even further, and 9/11, I was in my office at FEMA. My office phone rang, answered it. It was a friend of mine in India. The first thing she said, "Are you okay?" So you start to get a sense of the scale. So you need the reliability, and then you need that surge capacity. Because if you've ever listened to a 911 call, those 911 calls in disasters, any 911 call is heartbreaking. But in disasters, it's just the volume, the sheer volume, the call after call after call of the anxiety, the fear, and not knowing what to do, needing help from healthcare, from rescue services, And so that's really why it's so critical for disasters.
Absolutely. I think I shared off camera that growing up in Florida in the 90s, we had a lot of hurricanes, especially that one particular year, and it has been drilled into me the importance of those emergency communications and also having that infrastructure in place so that you can bounce back quickly after a disaster, and sometimes multiple disasters back to back. I think you already touched on this a little bit, but I would love to hear a little bit more about how you prepare for an event or a disaster, and a little more on how those systems like FirstNet and the climate data sharing partnerships contribute to that sense of knowing what to expect and how to prepare.
Well, preparing for disasters, first you need to sort of anticipate the threats and hazards that you might confront. Then you need to examine what you're going to need to be able to respond to that. And then you look at your existing assets, resources, capabilities, and then close the gap. That's really what we're trying to do. Now, the world is really changing. So in the emergency management community, we started marking billion-dollar disasters. So in the 80s, there were about $3 billion disasters a year. Last year alone, there were 28. Now, that's just the threshold of $1 billion. In 2017, Harvey, Irma, Maria, those hurricanes, the cost went to almost $400 billion. So we're seeing this increase of disasters. Everybody knows this. You don't need data to tell you this. We all know this. And so one of the reasons I'm really happy to be here today is because of our collaboration with AT&T. So for the past 2.5 years, we've been working with AT&T and with Argonne National Laboratory and the Department of Energy to develop dynamically downscaled forecast climate data. So this is data that is produced by the supercomputer up at Argonne National Laboratory. It requires a massive amount of computing power because you're modeling the climate with 60+ variables and progressing that climate to the end of century. So we're developing this data and then we're making it accessible to the public on a GIS platform. That's the kind of government, private sector partnership that I think can make a difference. I fully appreciate the challenges of regulations, but there are ways that the government and the private sector can work together, and I think this is a great example. It's called the Climate Risk and Resilience Portal, or CLIMER. All of the data is there for multiple hazards through the end of century, and that's the kind of information we need to start planning ahead for the future.
It makes me feel good that, that you all are on it. Kevin, I think this is a great time to turn to you. I would love to talk a little bit about your work in the sustainability field. How can upgraded networks help contain the damage when there is this type of weather event that we're talking about?
Well, thank you. When you heard Chris speak earlier about what it takes to repair copper infrastructure versus fiber, translate that into a sustainability conversation. So if you need to go out and dig up a bunch of stuff if the copper's buried underground and put fans on it, what do you think that it takes? It takes a lot of electricity. If you have to go and repair overhead lines with these big, huge trucks rolling out and spanning across the entire community and spending 3 or 4x more time than fiber repairing that infrastructure, what do you think that takes? That's diesel burning trucks. All of these details are now being captured in companies' carbon performance. So we talked a lot already about economic performance, which is absolutely crucial, but increasingly policy and the general trend lines across our society, carbon is going to be increasingly monetized as a balance sheet item. It's also a company risk, and it's a societal objective, which is to decarbonize our economy, to protect against catastrophic events. So when you look at the repair requirements to not just maintain, but after a major event, restore service, the energy requirements are dramatic. And that doesn't even begin to get into the energy requirements and efficiency value of fiber versus copper. So when you look at comparisons, and this has been done by many telecommunications infrastructure organizations around the world, it's been further supported by government agencies, the European Commission, and many other scientific organizations, the energy efficiency of fiber is anywhere from 60 to 90% more efficient than copper. And so mentally, I think when we hear percentages, percentages form like a comparative basis. And so you could say, okay, if we think about the electricity requirements of running digital infrastructure today, you can get your head around, that's a pretty big number, 60 to 90% energy savings for fiber versus copper. But look ahead into the future. You know, a huge part of public conversation today, just this morning, Scarlett Johansson's voice is being used by OpenAI. You know, OpenAI is showing up in our lives almost every day now. What do you think the energy requirements are going to be when generative AI comes into our life? It's going to make the energy demands of cryptocurrency look like child's play. Jennifer Granholm, the cabinet secretary for the Department of Energy, was at Microsoft's campus recently and exploring the possibility of allowing Microsoft to create mini nuclear power plants on their corporate campus because of the energy demands of generative artificial intelligence. So when you look at infrastructure, you have to recognize, I have 13 and 18-year-old boys. What do? They play Fortnite with their friends. I don't know if any of you all know about this game. They're on their cell phones talking, and they're on their game playing, and I am certain there's a lot of hamster wheels spinning in the background to allow them to play that game. And so life is going to be more digital and data intensive, period, full stop. And if the requirements to generate and deliver that continue to run off copper infrastructure, we have no chance to meet our climate objectives. No chance. And when you look at companies like AT&T and any other telecommunications provider, they're responsible to their shareholders, they're responsible to their communities, they're responsible to policymakers, and they're responsible to the organizations that they serve, that they're part of their supply chain, to be more responsible from a sustainability perspective. And so the fiber optic story is a sustainability story. It's not just an economic story or a resilience story. And so it's really important to recognize that we don't get to the future of technology progress, not just because of the bandwidth, but because of the sustainability. If we have to scale to generative AI off copper, we're toast. And so it's, you know, the sustainability agenda is a really important consideration. It's not necessarily the one that gets the most attention in the public. You know, oftentimes we look at cars and other types of personal decisions from a sustainability perspective, but some of these infrastructure, I'll just say one more data point and then close, is when you look at the legacy decommissioning of copper infrastructure, you know, AT&T's projections, and they've already decommissioned a lot, from 2024 to 2028, would be the equivalency, that alone, of 96,000 homes for a whole year. And keep in mind, too, that when you decommission copper, you heard Chris speak earlier about some of the copper wires are still in use from 100 years ago. That copper can be reused. Where do we get copper today? We have to mine it. Mining is pretty nasty stuff. And when we can recycle that copper, fold it into the production stream, and by the way, copper, this is now a national security issue. It is a critical mineral in all parts of the electric vehicle and sustainability agenda of the future and the electrification agenda. So all that copper that can get decommissioned can also get reused and repurposed in other areas. So it's not just that you're replacing one with the other and then you just count the clock going forward. There's actually a lot of sustainability value of recycling that copper when you bring it back. So I think that, you know, this transition from a sustainability perspective is something that we, looking across the business community, applaud and support and really recognize how critical it is to all of our sustainability objectives, which I think is a shared consideration that we all have.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Saad, I would love to turn to you to talk about your work in healthcare, which obviously we recognize as another critical infrastructure sector. It's also a sector that's highly connected, more so than ever before. So I would love to hear how you meet those challenges facing healthcare systems and how these hospital networks need to evolve to meet those challenges.
Yeah, so, you know, healthcare hasn't historically been known for being at the cutting edge of technology. And for good measure, where we're dealing with human lives, we're dealing with humans who are at their most vulnerable when they're coming to us, and any large-scale changes that even affect a single person sitting in the ED and how they could receive life-changing care would be detrimental. So that's absolutely understandable. What makes it a little bit more difficult in healthcare is that there are layers upon layers of interconnectivity between both software-level things, applications and whatnot, and also hardware-level things. So those are your biomedical devices, things that you as a patient are connected to that go beep, beep, beep in your patient room and have all these lights blinking on and off. And a lot of these things now are connected and constantly sending data in the background to allow for that continuum of care to occur when you're in the hospital or in the outpatient ambulatory clinic. The problem is they're all working off of Wi-Fi for the most part. And I have yet to meet, in my 21 years of healthcare tech experience, a single clinician that says, I love Wi-Fi. Nobody likes Wi-Fi, right? We have these computers, laptops on wheels. They call them cows, computers on wheels. That's a terrible acronym, right? And if you're going down the hallway at a hospital, you'll notice these cows herd together in the hallways. And that's because the nurses and the docs will say, the Wi-Fi signal is the best in that spot. And so it defeats the purpose of, number one, there being a laptop, and number two, them being wireless, and number three, them being on wheels, because they're all plugged in the same spot where they feel Wi-Fi is the best. Now, we have invested in healthcare sector at large and individual hospital millions of dollars in the IT infrastructure. But as most of you know, the Wi-Fi tech that we've had for decades, if you have too many access points, that's also bad. You have to architect these 100-year-old buildings sometimes over and over again so you don't overlap the signal, because when it does, those cows herd in the hallways, and all of a sudden your workforce isn't really that mobile. FirstNet is actually an answer to both inside the hospitals and facilities and outside. So we speak of disaster, and you don't really have to look further than 2020 for healthcare, global pandemic, right? We had an influx of patients that we couldn't interact with the same way we had been previously, so we had to put tents out in our parking lots. Now, that plain old Wi-Fi that was having problems running in our buildings inside, you could probably imagine how that was outside, right? So FirstNet, that works seamlessly, especially with their MEC tech, inside the building and outside. That was life-saving. And even at the heaviest of concentrations, at the largest of healthcare centers around the country, there wasn't really an overwhelming burden on the networks because it was a completely separate network. And the running joke, I believe, in Dallas for AT&T is that you used to measure traffic for users based on how slowed down traffic would become on the commercial airwaves during Super Bowl. A lot of people concentrated at around the stadium. And I think now the measure is Taylor Swift concerts, right? Or maybe like the trifecta, Taylor Swift at a Super Bowl and in a very populated center. But FirstNet still measures up. And so I'm looking in healthcare down the line, not that far, 6 years, 7 years, 2030, and over 20% of our country's population is going to be over retirement age. And so you're looking at an influx of geriatric care. Mm-hmm. And for those of you that may not be aware, geriatric care isn't a specialty that's very focused, like oncology or pediatrics even. It's essentially just a grouping of everything together. And most of the time, it has to be provided in an acute care setting, which is to say somewhere where you have a patient room. And so we're not going to have space to be able to provide care to our own citizens, our own residents, our own folks in the country in 6 years. We're not going to have enough hospital rooms. And so what has to happen is an active planning for a future of hospital at home, home health, whatever you want to call it. And that's essentially things that you would find inside a patient room working at your home, possibly by your couch instead of your bed or wherever. And so I ask you, how much fun do you think it's going to be to have Wi-Fi at home support those devices? Have any of you tried helping your grandparents and parents troubleshoot Wi-Fi remotely? I mean, have you even tried it yourself? Because it gets really complicated very quickly, right? So we can't afford to rely on home internet and Wi-Fi for that day to come. We've already seen what happens when we just kind of rest back and just wait for a disaster and overwhelming volume. We have to prepare now. So we're thinking all these devices that go beep, 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 all the blinking lights, they must be enabled with a SIM card. And they must be set up and configured in such a way with the healthcare organization in mind where they just work out of the box. And so you're not on the phone saying, have you rebooted the computer? Have you moved the antennas around? Have you unplugged or plugged it back in? Although there probably will be a fair amount of that still. And things just work and are able to transmit the data securely. And I'll end with this one last thing because we touched upon it a little bit, the security of networks. So you guys maybe have heard in the news of large-scale cybersecurity attacks as of late in healthcare. Change Healthcare, which is a subsidiary of Optum, which is owned by United Healthcare Group, which is the largest healthcare company in the world, period. So if the attackers, be it state-sponsored or otherwise, are going after the biggest whales possible, what hope does a $1.5 billion annual revenue organization like mine have against such overwhelming odds? You know, we even misspell the word luminous, and we still get found and attacked. We're attacked over 250 times per second. Per second. We're a 10,000 employee organization in Middle Maryland, right? So imagine what's happening at Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, Johns Hopkins. And so if you're relying on these layered some gigahertz Wi-Fi networks, if you're relying on X-ray machines that still run on Windows 95, true story, they do. Most of the places you go to get X-rays, they're running on Windows 95. If you're relying on these things, you may want to isolate them. You may want to have secure way of getting the data from them into the systems that will allow the physicians and nurses and everybody in between to provide care. And that, again, comes back to something like FirstNet.
Excellent. Well, I hate to say it, we're already running short on time, but I want to do sort of a rapid fire round before we turn it over to the audience for questions. I'm actually going to start with you, Saad, and then maybe we can, have it move down the line. What would you say is the biggest innovation that's coming next in your field? I don't know if that's home health, if that's something else, and how do you need communications networks to support it?
So the biggest innovation right now is the ability to provide a lot of the other innovations generally, so like generative AI. That's going to assist us in a shrinking workforce, but that requires a huge amount of data to be moved very, very quickly. And so that is a struggle, as I mentioned in my long-winded response before, for an organization and an industry like ours in healthcare.
Excellent. Kevin, any thoughts on the biggest innovation coming to your industry and how you need
well, looking across digital, I think it has to be generative artificial intelligence. And again, to just be cognizant of the requirements of digital infrastructure and data centers in the processing of that and the energy intensity and the broadband intensity to run those systems is massive. And it's going to make a lot of things that we've done historically look small by comparison. And so having the infrastructure not just be resilient, but be capable of processing all of that is going to be critically important.
Karen, any thoughts?
Similar thoughts. For us, I think I would add better real-time data, so a better network of sensors and getting that sort of real-time data, communicating better with the community, making sure that individuals also have access to real-time data. On the management side, I would agree, and for emergency managers, it's all about systems thinking and systems decision making. That's a challenge for humans. So I think the more AI can help us with that, that'd be great. And then the last one I would add is I would love to see better simulations. One of the most critical things in emergency management is exercises, practicing, drills, that kind of thing. And I think the healthcare system does a better job of that. They have simulated operation theaters. I think we need something similar to that with technology to really simulate that decision-making under stress.
Almost a national disaster wargaming scenario.
Exactly, yep.
Great. Well, let's turn it over to the audience for any questions. Do we have any questions in the audience? And we'll have mics if you can raise your hand, and we'll make sure we can all hear you. If not, I will ask one more of my own questions because I've not even gotten to half of them. All right. So something else I wanted to ask you guys is, how do you think about using data in your fields, and how will data increasingly have an effect on how you're planning for these future emergencies and how you're planning to upgrade your networks?
I think the government has really made a strong shift towards data-driven decision-making. Now, not all data is created equal. So I think that's really an area that we probably need to examine more closely, that I'm sure you guys as well have heard statistics just sort of repeated and take on a life of their own. So I think we need to be a little careful about that all data is not necessarily the best or the right data for a decision. But data is absolutely critical. Data is information in everything we do. And again, back to that sort of future climate forecast data, that is going to be critical for us planning the workforce in the future, the resources we need, and adaptability. Are we going to start moving people, moving communities once we see where the climate changes are taking effect? It's about prioritization. Absolutely, everything we do is based on data, but we do have to be careful about the data we're using.
I think that's a really good caution.
There's also the amount of data in general, right? So I love the statistic. It's been repeated many times, but from the dawn of man to early 2000s, the human race created about 7 exabytes of data. And now we're creating about 7 exabytes of data every 2 days, right? So we talk about AI, but the reason that is game-changing is because all of a sudden you don't need fancy software that shows you visually what your data is. You can just outsource that part to make sense of that data, the insane amount of data that is created by the human race every single day. And in places where you can predict natural disasters so you can save human lives, or you're actually working on saving a human life in a hospital setting, that is a game changer. But that requires a level of transparency where there's networks, security through cybersecurity, and of course, the ability to just have the bandwidth to be able to transfer it. And that's where our partners here at AT&T help.
Great. Kevin, any thoughts on data before we wrap up?
I would just say that with the explosion, I think there's also an exercise that has to be done in sort of the aggregation and architecting of the data in order for it to be analyzed. And there's, of course, a lot of energy intensity in that. But just like in emergency response or in healthcare, the broader sustainability field is dealing with massive amounts of data as well to figure out how do policymakers make the right decisions about where they can get the most ROI from a policy perspective on a sustainability intervention to get a climate outcome. And so just as every other field has data dependency, so does the field of sustainability.
Definitely. Well, what I'm hearing is this all comes back to having these very strong networks that can handle the influx of data, that can handle all of these predictions and natural disasters and the incoming flood of geriatric care and all of the things that the future brings. Wonderful. Well, it's been lovely to speak with you all. Thank you so much for being here. If I failed to introduce myself to you earlier, I'm Kelcee Griffis with Brew. You can read my reporting 3 times a week in your inbox at the Emerging Tech Brew newsletter. Now I'd like to invite everybody to hang around, spend a few minutes looking at the AT&T Innovation exhibit. I hear that it's really cool. There's some artifacts that show the progress of network modernization through the years, so please make sure you check it out. Thanks again.